The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, TVO visited the Parkdale Queen West Community Health Center to see how a so-called safe consumption site helps those battling addiction. First up, John Michael McGrath and yours truly unpack the Ontario Liberals' new major tax cut policy announcement. OnPoli is next. JMM?
Oh, sir.
Good to see you, pal.
Good to see you.
I wanted to start by updating everybody on something we talked about last week, which was the triumphant return to Queen's Park by 100-year-old Lieutenant General Richard Rohmer, who, yes, got the invitation after missing a few years because of his health, got the invitation from Premier Ford to return to Queen's Park, give the speech at Remembrance Day ceremonies, and I'm wearing the same thing today I wore on Monday at Queen's Park at the Remembrance Day ceremonies, Juno 1944, lest we forget. He came, he saw, he conquered, if I can borrow an expression. He did a great job and spoke on behalf of the troops, 100 years old, at the lectern. And if you know General Rohmer, as most people do, you knew that he wasn't going to let the Premier get off scot-free. And actually, Sheldon, can we just do this here? You want to scroll through some of the pictures from last Monday at Queen's Park? This is November 11th. Here's the General. He needs a walker now, but he's still pretty good. He comes in, chest full of medals. Remember, he was, somebody in a speech referred to Juno Beach, 1944, D-Day, and apparently the General leaned over to somebody he was sitting beside and he said, "I was there." And I guarantee you he was the only guy at that service.
I mean, if you had been there, you would be reminding people of that too.
He was there, yes indeed. That's Laura Smith. Now, she's the MPP for Thornhill. This is after the service is over. She's thanking him for his service. We don't really have a Veterans Affairs Minister at Queen's Park, so Laura Smith is the parliamentary assistant who is responsible for the military file, if you like. And so she wanted, on behalf of the government, to thank the General for coming. There's Doug Ford at the lectern, and he's sort of pointing to that black granite wall, which General Rohmer chaired the committee to get that thing built. This was back when Dalton McGuinty was Premier of Ontario. And the General sort of snuck in an etching of his Mustang plane that he flew back during World War II, and that's somewhere on that wall. And at one point, when he was at the microphone, he said to Premier Ford, "Now look, the south side of the wall looks great, and we love that, but the north side of the wall is black and has nothing." And he said, "I've been trying for years to get any government to put on there, engrave in there, Ontario Veterans Memorial or something like that." And he looked at Premier Ford and he said, "Now, Premier Ford, you're supposed to be a guy who can get things done, so I'm saying to you, let's get this done." We'll see if the Premier comes through for him. Anyway, it was really terrific to see him back there and looking so good, sounding so good, back where he belongs.
And I imagine the Premier put on the spot like that is giving some thought to seeing what he can do.
I guarantee you he is.
With that, on to issue one.
Right on. Ontario Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie announced her first major campaign promise, a tax cut for the middle class and a cut to the HST on home heating bills. Let's have a look.
As Premier, I'll immediately do two things to put more money back into your pockets. First, I'll cut your income taxes. And then I'll get rid of the sales tax on home heating and hydro bills. This will be the largest tax relief for the people of Ontario in over a decade.
Let's get some more deets on this, if you would, JMM.
Yeah, absolutely. So in total, the cuts are projected to cost about $2.8 billion. Of course, the way the Liberal Party is phrasing this, and this is something they've borrowed from the Tories, and this will deliver $2.8 billion in relief to taxpayers. Mm-hmm. Just an accounting identity, one way or the other. The tax cut would amount to about $950 annually to the average household. Sorry, that's the income tax cut. And then the HST cut would provide 5 million households with about $200.
You won't be surprised the first questions that came at the press conference were, "Okay, Leader Crombie, how are you going to pay for all this?" And her answer was, "I'm going to stop the giveaways." And by that she meant the $200 checks that the Ford government is going to mail out to people in the new year, $500 million for a parking lot for a waterfront spa, $225 million for the Brewers to end an agreement 1 year early, $2 billion in lost revenue from scrapping the cap-and-trade anti-pollution system, et cetera, et cetera. She says the government has made choices. They are the wrong choices. She says she would make better choices, different choices than the Premier. And actually, while we're on the subject here, do you want to compare the tax cut that she is offering to the $200 rebate checks that the Premier is offering? What's the diff?
Well, there's a few differences here. I mean, the government is talking about this check as a one-time dividend, if you like. It doesn't affect the overall rate of income taxes that you pay. The tax cuts proposed by Crombie here are actually, I mean, they would lower your income tax rate, and they would be permanent, or at least as permanent as any change in the tax code is. So, the Liberals here are trying to, I think it's fair to say, outflank the Progressive Conservatives on the tax file.
That is very unconventional thinking in politics, and we should spend a second here just talking about this, because the conventional wisdom in politics has always been, if one party owns an issue, you don't compete with them on that issue. You try and make your news on another issue. Now, the Tories have been identified with tax cuts ever since Mike Harris ran as the tax fighter. We're going back to 1990 now. It was the first campaign that he ran as the tax fighter. So it's interesting that the Liberals are choosing to compete on that ground with the Conservatives, just as sort of, if you look at the other side of the coin, Conservatives tend not to try to compete with Liberals on health and education because they figure that's not our issues and we're not going to beat them on that, so we let them have that. Interesting that Bonnie Crombie is really driving in Doug Ford's lane here. I guess we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also in the context, and anybody who's been listening to this podcast for the last few months knows this, the Tories have really spent the past year since she won the leadership trying to brand Bonnie Crombie as, queen of the carbon tax, and they have alleged that she would, increase any number of taxes were she to form government. So this move seems like both a sword against the Tories and also a shield to try and defend herself from the attacks that they're not just coming, they have already started. So it's going to be interesting to judge how it works on both of those aspects, I think.
Sword and a shield.
Yes.
Give me a double sugar. That's a good metaphor, buddy. Didn't see that coming. And with that, let's get off to issue 2. The bill has come due. The cost to remove all those bike lanes in Ontario's capital city, $48 million. And the province says it'll pick up the tab. Next question. How wise an expenditure is this? JMM has some views, I bet.
Sure, absolutely. Let's get some of the numbers down first. These numbers come from a recently released City of Toronto report. It says the cost of installing these bike lanes was $27 million. It suggests that removing them would be more expensive still, as much as $48 million. The staff acknowledged that it's a very incomplete estimate at this point. And they are saying that removing these bike lanes would cause the very congestion that Premier Ford says that he is trying to avoid. So the city is saying that, among other things, removing these bike lanes would also conflict with any number of other provincial policies, including changes to the Planning Act and the provincial policy statements. One thing that I found really interesting, and I'm restraining myself from going too deep on these nerdy details, but when you build like a condo tower in Toronto, the city requires that you build a certain amount of parking spaces, or it used to. And it was always the case that developers would build exactly the number of parking spaces that they were required to and no more, because parking is very expensive. One of the things that the city report notes is that actually recently they've seen the opposite, that developers are building more bike parking than they are required to by the zoning bylaw. It's obviously cheaper, so they don't mind that. It gives them goodwill with council. They don't mind that. But there's also demand for it. So those are just some of the things that I took from the city report that I found very interesting.
There has been a lot of fudging on the numbers here by all sides, I think. I know the Premier and his Transportation Minister keep saying, look, we're ripping these bike lanes out because only 1.2% of Torontonians commute to work, and therefore we're not going to curry favor with this little, small, insignificant part of the population. How accurate is that 1.2% number?
Not at all, in short. We always knew that was, frankly, a suspect number. We've known for a while that the number actually dates back to 2011. I'm going to gently suggest to people that there are more cyclists on the road than there were in 2011. And it refers to commutes done across the entire Toronto census metropolitan area, which is a much, much wider area than just the city of Toronto itself. It includes like Orangeville. It's just not a relevant geography to compare to here. We do have more recent data, more substantial data. The city participates in what's called the Transportation Tomorrow Survey. It is a survey run by the Provincial Ministry of Transportation. It helps the province plan its transportation priorities over years and even more than a decade. The city sort of wasn't supposed to release this data, and yet it was somehow provided to the Toronto Star. And the data suggests that, look, no surprise, cyclists are still a minority among commuters. I certainly have never argued otherwise. But when we're talking about downtown Toronto, which I think is the most relevant geography here, where most of these bike lanes are or where they lead to, motorists are not the most common commuters either. Transit users are. 45% of commutes into the downtown are by transit, 25% by car, and 9% by bike. So another way to put that is, frankly, in a city where there's still a lot of hostility to cyclists and cycling infrastructure, cyclists make up a third as many commuters in the downtown area as motorists.
And you're just referring there to commuting for work. There's obviously a lot of cycling that happens outside of going to work, coming home from work.
Hop on the bike, go get the groceries, that kind of thing, right? There's a lot more to our lives than just going to and from work.
Exactly right. Now, we know, of course, the Mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, is a big advocate for cycling. She wants these lanes in here. She's not pleased about the fact that they're being ripped out, even if the province is offering to pay for it. But here's the big question. Is there anything she can actually do about this?
So let's turn our minds back to Bill 5, the law from for its first term in office that cut Toronto City Council in half, right? The Supreme Court eventually found in a 5-4 decision that that law was constitutional because municipalities are merely creatures of the province, as we like to say. So at the end of the day, if the legislature puts its foot down, no, there is really nothing that Toronto City Council can do through its powers or through the mayor's powers that could trump provincial law.
She's got one thing going for her. She's got the bully pulpit. That's it, right?
And she's using that, like that's, she did not write this report that we're pulling all of these numbers from, but she did use her the powers of her office to get staff to put those numbers together. She is making the most forceful argument for these bike lanes that she can. And I don't think this is the end of it by any means. I think every single controversial decision that the Ford government has made since 2018 has been challenged in court. And I suspect that we will see some kind of court challenge launched here as well. I'm not sure exactly what those grounds are. There are things that, whether it's provincial or federal or municipal jurisdiction, like no Canadian government can violate the charter. Will somebody make a charter argument about this? We'll see.
We shall see. I know one thing. We're going to talk about this a week Monday on the agenda on whether Doug Ford really wants to be the Premier of Ontario or the Mayor of Toronto, because that is a big subject for discussion at Queen's Park. And with that, we're off to issue 3. Let's talk about firefighting for a moment. There is a bill that's been making its way through the legislature called Bill 190, and it has now received royal assent, which means it's now the law. It amended a variety of worker-related things, including removing the need to provide a sick note to your employer. But one amendment in particular has drawn attention to wildland firefighters. JMM, the deets, if you would.
Right. So the amendment to this act that has now been passed would make it easier for wildland firefighters to receive what's called presumptive coverage, which, as the name implies, it presumes that if you have gotten an illness, that you got that illness because of the work you are doing. This is common for not just wildland firefighters, but if you think of firefighters in cities, for example, you tend to inhale a lot of smoke, and sometimes that smoke isn't just wood. Sometimes it's more harmful substances that burn, and so lung infections and lung diseases are very common among firefighters. And so when we talk about workplace safety insurance, these kinds of compensations, one of the rules is just, if you get these kinds of diseases, rather than arguing about, was this really caused by your employment and going through all those arguments, the presumption is just, if you've gotten this condition, then you are presumed to have gotten through it through work, and your employer, in this case the government of Ontario, will just pay for your treatment or whatever is required. And so this will just make it easier for those workers to get the kind of compensation that they would get in other contexts.
In which case, what's the issue here?
Well, under the Act, wildland firefighters now receive this coverage after 10 years of service rather than 15. However, this is, I think, this is the kind of detail you see a lot in government. A fire season only counts as a half year of service. So you need to actually accrue 20 years of wildland firefighting to be eligible for 10 years of service.
Because 20 equals 10 at Queen's Park.
Yes, exactly. Now, the province doesn't have, it could, I suppose, legislate this kind of change. They are instead working with the Workplace Safety Insurance Board to change this kind of rule.
Okay, what else is up on this? What else do we need to know?
As you can probably guess, wildland firefighting is very dangerous. Just aside from the obvious danger of fighting fires, cancer is the leading cause of death for these workers. It is also, as you can imagine, very stressful, very mentally taxing. There is a lot of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, among these firefighters. Wildland firefighters have long called for acknowledgement of these dangers and certainly more education for trainees on the job. There's also, again, one of these details that you see all the time in government. There's an issue of classification. Wildland firefighters are not actually classified as firefighters the way that the province, firefighters at the municipal level, their labor conditions are governed by a certain provincial law. Wildland firefighters are not. They are called resource technicians. OPSU, the union representing wildland firefighters, would like to see their classification changed. That could result in higher pay, longer retention, and better benefits.
I'm not asking you to take a position on this, but presumably if these folks are getting sick doing work that we really need them to do, it behooves us to do right by them. Fair to say?
Yes, I think so. And this has been an ongoing issue. I mean, we saw how bad the wildfire season could get a few years ago where, I was biking to work wearing an N95 because the sky in August here in Toronto was like orange from, fire smoke. I think we are likely to continue to need at least as many wildland firefighters in the future. And one of the other issues, and we're not even talking about that here so much, but OPSU has really raised a lot of concerns about whether we are funding this service at the levels that will be needed in the future, given a warming planet.
We'll keep an eye on this story as it percolates through the legislature. And with that, it's off to your column, my column. Time now for our regular weekly feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns that we wrote for the TVO website this past week. What do you got for us today?
Well, I actually can't reminisce about this one because it has not yet been published due to some unforeseen circumstances. I'm actually going to get to give our listeners a preview of what is coming early next week, probably on Monday. There is a new report from the FAO, this is the Financial Accountability Office, of course, that says that in 2024, Ontario's cost of living crisis is overwhelmingly a housing cost crisis. Inflation outside of shelter costs is now less than 1%. The bad news is that housing starts are abysmal, and the 1.5 million new homes target that the government has set is more or less entirely out of reach. Obviously, really bad news from the FAO. There is, I suspect, more coming because there is a press conference at Queen's Park on Monday with a variety of environmental groups in a coalition. They are releasing a report saying that they are giving the government a grade on its housing policies, knowing who makes up this coalition. I very, very strongly suspect that it will not be a passing grade, unless maybe it's a gentleman's C. I will be at that press conference on Monday morning, and I will be writing about all of this for the website. I expect that column will be up either Monday afternoon or Tuesday morning.
Excellent.
How about you, Steve?
Well, I wrote a column that I guess I would describe as bittersweet this week. It was about a guy that maybe our listeners or viewers will remember, a guy named David Kaplan, who was a cabinet minister during the Dalton McGuinty years at Queen's Park. David, actually, it's a bit of a family story. His mother was both a North York City councillor, an Ontario MPP, and a federal MP. And when she left provincial to go federal, creating a by-election, David went in there and won the seat. So he followed in his mother's footsteps. She was health minister. He was health minister. Followed in his mother's footsteps in that way, too. He was also the infrastructure minister. How do I put this? To this date, no one is actually 100% sure what happened 5 years ago when David was home alone. He was expected to go up to his family's cottage and join the rest of his family there, but there was an explosion in the house, and David was killed from the injuries sustained in that explosion. And I wanted to write about him today because today, the 15th of November, he would have been 60 years old. A couple of weeks ago, Toronto City Councillor Shelley Carroll, well, I guess it goes back further than that, she got the wheels in motion to an event that happened 2 or 3 weeks ago, where David had a park named in his honor in Don Mills. And if we can, Sheldon, let's scroll through some of the pictures here and we'll just go back. There is the sort of wide shot of the new David Kaplan Park in Don Mills. Right across the road from this, incidentally, is his old constituency office. So it's in the neighborhood of where he spent so much of his time. There he is getting sworn in. I'm not sure which election that is, him getting sworn in. Probably the first one, surrounded by his staff at Queen's Park. That was a big day, following in Mum's footsteps. And there's his mother, Eleanor, on the left with his widow, Lee, and then his son, Jacob, on the right, giving a speech at the opening of the park. And it was, I got to say, there weren't too many dry eyes in the house. It was a pretty lovely moment seeing this. And that's David's final resting place up in York Region in the city of Vaughan. David would have been 60 today. He spent a lot of time when he was at Queen's Park working on a bill called Places to Grow, which you know all about as a planning guy. Basically governing growth. Here's where we can intensify. Here's where we really shouldn't do any development at all. And everybody kind of agreed that it was a beautiful thing that David got a park. He spent a lot of time working for families and working to ensure adequate park space and places for families to take their kids. So for all of those reasons, I wanted to write about David Kaplan this week. And I add this postscript.
Yes.
The guy who produces our podcast, Matthew O'Mara, let me know that when David Kaplan was an MPP, Matthew was one of his constituents. And Matthew also, I guess when he was a little kid, was a page at Queen's Park. And he met with David when he was a page at his constituency office, actually ahead of applying for the program. He got some pointers. I think David gave him some souvenir pins. And he credits David Kaplan, along with his parents, with helping him, Matthew, get his start along the path that has now seen him produce a weekly podcast about Queen's Park. So the people whom David Kaplan influenced, the list is very long.
Well, and I will just add one other milestone. My first time on TVO's airwaves with you on an agenda panel included David Kaplan and other people, but I only met him very briefly, but he was immediately just lovely and kind and extremely warm. And, one of those people who, when he died, you could see the shock move through Queen's Park that day. It was really sad.
Was he the minister when he was on that show with you? Do you recall?
No, he was a former MPP at that point.
He was former,
but he was speaking on behalf of the Liberals, I believe, on that panel.
Okay, because I do remember him when he was a minister coming on the agenda with critics, which is something ministers almost never do. I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of ministers who have been brave enough to come on our program and have a debate with his or her critics, and David did it. And I thought, there's a guy who kind of has confidence in what he's doing, he believes in what he's doing, and he's not afraid to have the debate in a public place with others, which he did with his typical civility. Anyway, we remember David Kaplan today.
And with that, let's go to the mailbag.
If you've got a burning question or an insightful comment, we always love hearing from you. The email address is onpolitics@tvo.org. Get us started, JMM.
Right. We have a letter from Ivan Mirko-Sanjanovic from Toronto who writes, Dear On Poly Podcast, I have a hypothetical question that might be fun to entertain. And indeed, it was fun to entertain. With the dominance of the PC party in Ontario, are there any legalistic obstacles that would prevent a one-time NDP Liberal coalition with a single mandate to institute preferential voting and then immediately call another election afterwards? Cheers, IMS.
Well, this really is an unusual scenario. Thank you for the question, Yvonne. Now, a little background here. Ranked balloting was something that the previous Liberal government in Ontario passed and allowed. Said municipalities, you want to do ranked balloting, where you don't just go to the poll and pick one choice. You pick your first, second, third, fourth choices and so on. And then the bottom candidate drops off and those votes are reassigned so that whoever wins actually, at the end of the day, gets more than 50% of the votes. For many people, there's an added legitimacy to that system. Anyway, some municipalities were using that system. When Doug Ford became premier, he canceled that form of elections.
Yes.
So, to answer, Yvonne, your direct question, if the PCs were not to win a majority in the next election, there is nothing legally preventing the New Democrats, Liberals, and Greens from combining forces, defeating the government, setting up a coalition government, changing the voting system, and then seeking a new mandate on the voting system by calling an immediate election. There's nothing illegal about that. Now, that's not to say it's not complicated. And McGrath, you give the complications.
Right. So, and these are not legalistic complications, but they are political ones. So let's start with it costs $150 million, give or take, to hold an election. Would you want to spend that much money again so soon? Would you be able to answer to the voters for spending that much money so soon? What would turnout be like the second time around? Would turnout increase because there's this new exciting way to vote? Or would turnout drop because people would say, oh, like we just did this. The Tories would not unjustifiably cry foul because this would be opposition parties changing the voting system really specifically to harm the Progressive Conservative Party and change it in a very substantial way, right? Under the first past the post system, we functionally give 100% of the political power to a party that gets 40% of the vote. But maybe the showstopper here is that the New Democrats and Liberals do not agree on preferential or ranked ballots. The NDP have a very, very long history of supporting proportional representation. They have, I mean, federally, we saw this play out where the Liberals proposed ranked balloting and the NDP very strongly reacted against it. They believe that ranked balloting will sort of structurally prefer the Liberals for, all time to come and don't particularly want that system. The Liberals, of course, conversely believe that proportional representation will just help the NDP and hurt them. So even if you stipulated that the parties were willing to do this kind of one-time coalition deal, getting them to actually agree on the specific electoral reform is really who will bell the cat kind of question.
I think what you're saying is it's legal, but ain't no way in hell it's ever going to happen.
I mean, never say never, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it.
Right on. But Yvonne, thanks for the intriguing idea. We did enjoy chewing the fat about that one.
Yes. Before we leave this bit, we do, of course, want to let people know that you can also these days ask us questions on Blue Sky, the relatively new social network. It is more or less like Twitter or formerly Twitter, now X, except I think we previously referred to it as not as many Nazis. Generally, a more pleasant, less toxic atmosphere, and I think we will have our profiles on the screen here.
Want to bring it up there? Oh, there we go. Okay. That's you, right?
That is me, yeah.
Okay. Have I got a profile on this thing, too? Oh, there's my profile. Okay, yeah. You got more followers than I do.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens next. I'm sure that many of your fans will now crowd to Blue Sky and
both of them
will get your numbers up. But I certainly this is the first time that has happened, because even when I came to TVO and I had a lot of Twitter followers for a TVO personality, you still had like way more than I did.
Well, all I can say, McGrath, is it's on. It's on. And I think I might have a couple of more followers than you on X.
Yes, I suspect that's true. I have just under 30,000 on Twitter, formerly X or whatever.
I have a couple of more than that.
Yeah, couple more.
I think so. Anyway, yes, indeed. Blue Sky Social, we invite you to follow us there as well.
Right, and you can always ask questions about content on the podcast. The old-fashioned way, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, November 15th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This is a site that is closing in March.
These sites offer a lot more than just watching people use drugs.
They get help here that they wouldn't get in a hospital, and they would get it done quicker here.
We do not supply drugs here in this space.
If I knew now back then, my brother would still be alive.
You can't recover, you can't be stabilized if you're dead.
They said that, you know what, we have a spot for you. You should have been not self-medicating. You should have had a doctor a long time ago. When they offered me that, I started to cry.
I think I have one of the best jobs in the city,
because my day is spent like building relationships and strengthening relationships with clients.
Of course, we respond to overdoses. We respond to at least one or two every single day. In addition to overdose response services in the site, we offer in-house referrals to dentistry, physiotherapy, get people connected to primary care and get them a family doctor or nurse practitioner.
And they'll help me get my resumes done and all that so I can go back to work again.
We're able to give in-house referrals to counseling and HIV program, Hep C program, and external referrals to detox if that's what people want, treatment beds if that's what people want.
I had a really bad accident. And so I went into a hip and muscle injury. So I wasn't too keen on doing the opioid thing. But that's a big part of what started the addiction.
I always tell people, you're one breakup, divorce, separation, job loss, depressive episode away from like an addiction. And I say that to say just the stories of clients, like what caused them to use, and it's usually based in trauma.
Everybody's affected by at least one family member, apparently. Or relationship down the road by someone that's self-medicating.
Hi there, I'd like to welcome you to the Parkdale Queen West supervised consumption site here in Toronto, Ontario. My name is Ray Clark, and I'm here to give you a client tour of what our service looks like. When clients enter the space, there's a check-in booth. They give us their anonymous code. We do not track the identity of the folks that are here. This is an anonymous service. Also, when clients check in here, we ensure that they have their pre-obtained drugs to use, as we do not supply drugs here.
My first experience of harm reduction was as someone seeking help. I grew up in Toronto with a lot of resources. I have a lot of support from my family. I had my education paid for. I've never had to worry about having a roof over my head. And still, when I was addicted to crystal meth. And when I wanted to seek help for that, I wasn't ready at that time to go for abstinence. That was too scary for me. Harm reduction was my foot in the door.
It takes time and process to move people towards a place where they may be ready for treatment. People are pre-contemplative. They have to there's a lot of movement and support that people need along the way to even get to that place. We know from data that people are at an increased risk of overdose when they're in these kind of in-between stages of their life, where they've just been released from jail or just been discharged from treatment, or they're waiting to get into a treatment bed and they're on a wait list. These are the gaps that overdose prevention sites fill, because people, knowing that risk, can come to a service where there's healthcare providers and peer workers.
I used to be a service user here, and then I became an employee here.
And I said, are you guys really going to help me? And they said, we can help you as much as we can, but you don't have to live on the streets. You don't have to self-medicate if you really want to change that. And I said, I want to change it. And so they gave me that choice. It wasn't forced on me, it was offered to me. And I was so tired of self-medicating.
I think there are people who think that we are enablers, and that it could be further from the truth. I think people who use, they're going to use regardless. We just ensure that they use safely.
I heard the word overdose, I thought death. It's someone is just dead. And it's so scary. It really is, it's so different. That's the thing, I'm it's so different than I ever thought it was.
I'm happy to ask you clear questions.
Sorry, no, I want to say this. So during the pandemic was when I started working with this community. I had a lot of my own hang-ups, and I just didn't know. I was like, is this going to be dangerous? I could not have had a more different experience dealing with these people.
Harm reduction is basically the idea that rather than trying to penalize people for doing drugs, we want to keep them safe and give them opportunities to take charge of their own health. So the idea is really just meeting people where they are at in this moment, not trying to change their, the trajectory of their life, but just trying to keep them alive. And it gives them clear view of the possibilities that exist down the road, whether it's treatment, whether it's supplemental like medications like methadone or Suboxone or some sort of like stepping stone in the path of that direction. There are people that want treatment. Right now I think it's a current wait of about 6 months for any like Ontario OHIP funded treatment programs. You can't predict what's going to happen in 6 months. You're asking people who are daily using an unregulated drug supply to hope that they're going to be alive in 6 months when that bed becomes available.
So I think often folks' journey here may begin with interfacing with one of our client support workers who then puts them in touch with the appropriate service, whether that's primary care, whether that's harm reduction, whether that's supervised consumption, whether that's counseling. We have a number of services within the building that all collaborate with our supervised consumption site.
I think the understanding sometimes of this space in particular is that we're just a safe consumption site. We are a community health center, so our range of services go from primary care to all community. When we say community health center, we mean community. It means everybody that lives in that community, which means there are children coming for primary care to come to see their dentist. There's like elderly people coming to do physiotherapy. Like there's people doing the diabetes program to come and do yoga on Tuesdays.
This is a foot care station, so a lot of the folks that we serve are people experiencing homelessness, and they're on their feet all day, and oftentimes people can't afford good footwear. People are getting used footwear that may fit appropriately or may not. All of our overdose prevention support staff and myself are trained in the in-low foot assessment for diabetic neuropathy and other things.
So we will talk about the community, and we mean people who come into this building. I will hear from people who are talking about the community, and they mean people who own a condo nearby. The community is both. Wanting to not see a problem doesn't make it go away. I think seeing people in pain is uncomfortable. It's sad, naturally people people don't want to see the fact that some people live on the street. That makes them sad. It makes me sad. That doesn't mean that they don't live there.
Discomfort is okay, but I feel as a, how do you as like a citizen, as a community member, feel watching a fellow citizen, a fellow community member in that state?
Things that made me feel like a part of a community and a bigger picture. And from that, I was able to apply for a job. These clients are very valuable people, and it's not a big driver as why I even wanted to get into this work. Was to give back and make sure that didn't happen to anyone else.
I've been here for just under 3 years, and this really is like it's home. Like it's a beautiful space. Like it comes alive. It's filled with art and culture, and everybody is really taking care of each other inside and out. If you live in a community, you should know everybody that's in that community. People that are unhoused are also your neighbors.
I think what's being lost in all of this political discourse and opinion pieces is that each of these lives is somebody who has hobbies, has friends, has family, has interests. These aren't just like disposable. Every life is precious, including the lives of people who use drugs.
I love to work out. Like I really like working out. I like the way it makes me feel.
I got back into knitting. I got back into doing a bit of sports as much as I could with my hip, right? Like swimming and all this that connected me with all these things.
I read a lot. I like reading. But nowadays they take a little longer to read. I like true stories and I like history.
My favorite season of the year is the winter. I love like walking in the snow, but it can get pretty cold outside because a lot of people that have addiction problems are not housed. We've got, 10,000 people right now in the streets. There's tents in all the parks. And this place in the daytime said, you know what, come on in and get warmed up, have a coffee. Are you okay? And that's the most important words to hear is, are you okay? Because at minus 20 below when you're out there in the tent, you're not okay.
There are really amazing people who have come into this site. People, people who are painters or former journalists or are so much more than just someone who uses drugs. And I don't think you can choose that life doesn't matter.
Supervised consumption sites are a really beautiful service that really does catch people when they fall through the cracks of a healthcare system in lots of different capacities.
They would do better in a place like this where they have RPNs here or nurses here that will do the minor stuff that they don't have to, get an okay from a doctor to deal with it. It not being a doctor, it would be a nurse.
I think these issues wouldn't be as stark as they are right now if there was sustained government financial support to the social services sector. If we were able to find permanent housing for someone and supports around that housing, we would actually be saving a lot more money in the long run.
The real problem is an opiate epidemic that everyone is aware of now, which I feel like generally, if you're going to deal with a problem, you need people to be alive.
People want to use in a safe, private place, and for lots of my folks who don't have housing, the only spaces available in society for them to use are public spaces.
The vast majority of clients that I work with at one point or another has said, I'm tired of this. And they've asked us to arrange detox beds and then for us as workers, it's frustrating that when we call the central intake number, there are no publicly funded detox beds. Clients are quoted amounts between $20,000 and $30,000 for a 30-day stay.
We've had supervised consumption sites in Ontario for about 7-8 years. And in that short amount of time, we've received a lot of data, actually, about the benefits that supervised consumption sites have on the surrounding community.
These sites were situated right in those neighborhoods where EMS was having the greatest concentration of overdose calls. And what we have seen is a dramatic reduction in the number of EMS calls and fatal overdoses within a kilometer of the site.
A social worker is only as good as the resources that they are able to provide. Over the last few decades, social workers have been really hampered by the resources we're able to provide.
Funding increase could scale up the operations of existing supervised consumption sites. We can address community concerns. We can approach our neighbors and we can talk about how we can mitigate and coexist together. This isn't an all or nothing kind of game, but with the decision to close SCSs, for some of our clients, it becomes an all or nothing game.
You feel like you only have seconds, but you have minutes. You don't have hours. So we're there to respond quickly and calmly.
Many people have experienced calling 911 where there's more than a 8, 15, 20-minute wait, even in Toronto. And one of my fears for when these sites are closed is that emergency medical services are not going to be able to keep up with all the calls that they're going to be getting.
I'll bring you into the SCS, or the supervised consumption room. As you can see, we have 4 booths. In this particular site, we supervise or witness 800 injections a month. On average, we have between 40 and 60 overdoses per month that we reverse or treat with oxygen.
I've seen people take like 4 breaths in a minute. That's not enough. But if what they're breathing in is pure oxygen, then you're preventing brain damage.
So a client's normal journey, they would come in, give us their code, tell us what they're using. They would ask for their harm reduction supplies. Syringes, tourniquets, sterile water, alcohol swabs. Clean supplies every time. We do not supply drugs. The risk of HIV infection and other bloodborne infections is greatly reduced.
The street supply, which we know through Toronto's drug checking service, it's contaminated with other drugs that people don't even think they're buying.
So another service that our clients have access to is Toronto's drug checking service. One, it provides important information to clients about trends in the drug supply seen in the city. And the second service that it provides is we can take a sample of their drugs and we can send it for analysis at one of 2 labs in Toronto.
People don't know the potency of what they're getting. It could be much weaker than what they bought yesterday, or it could be 10 times stronger, 1,000 times stronger, which really sets people up for overdoses. People can go to the LCBO and buy a bottle of whiskey where they know exactly the alcohol content of it, and they can see that it's not adulterated, and they know the potency, and they know that there's nothing else that can affect their health in what they're buying.
Like bars are safe consumption sites. I'm doing my smart serve now, and I'm seeing the similarities between what we do here and what a bartender does, right?
We just don't stigmatize alcohol as much as we do other substances.
For people to think that if you abolish these safe consumption sites, that there's suddenly not going to be any more drug use, that is very short-sighted. If you oppose and you close a safe consumption site, your entire community is now an unsupervised consumption site.
The needle exchange program here is at least 30 years old.
The community worries about things like finding needles and finding paraphernalia, which is a valid concern. Nobody in this space wants there to be needles and paraphernalia lying around. That's not what we're advocating for.
There's a perception that supervised consumption sites make drug use more visible and bring it into the public eye more, but the opposite of that is true. What happens in these sites is healthcare and overdose response, and I don't want that to fall into the public domain where it puts everyday neighbors and community members and families in the role of overdose response workers. It would be really meaningful for politicians to come into these sites. And I think there's a lot of value to actually look at the faces of the people who are impacted by these policy changes and hear from actual community about the harms that are going to be created.
My sense is we know a decent amount about the history of our military involvement in World War II. How would you characterize what Canadians know, Arne, about our post-World War II military engagements?
Well, to be succinct, virtually nothing. I come right out of the gate saying honestly that I don't think we pay virtually any attention to that, certainly not in a lot of classes that I'm familiar with, nothing directly. And in part it's because I think the narratives are quite different, right? Canada's service in places like Korea, those Canadians that volunteered for Vietnam, our engagements later in the 1990s, they didn't fit the narrative of sort of clean victory of morally and ethically correct wars. They were nasty in a lot of ways, politically nasty as much as anything else. And I think Canadians maybe are innately uncomfortable with that, particularly where we weren't peacekeepers, as the myth goes. So I think they're really largely neglected. That's been my experience on the front lines as a professor in the proverbial trenches, but also just in general with the Canadian public. I don't think we pay any attention to that sort of stuff.
Carrie Buck, what's your take on that?
Well, I think the stories we tell ourselves about what Canada does internationally on the military front have shifted over time. I agree that the history isn't well known in detail, but we do have a national narrative. So I think in the beginning, it was about Canada and Canadians seeing themselves as a middle power that punched above its weight. And that's the two world wars, and I'd add Korea to that. But then this shifted when peacekeeping was introduced and classical, easier, kind of more neutral peacekeeping. We saw ourselves as an honest broker and a peacekeeping nation. And I think that shifted again over time. I think today's narrative is slightly different. We understand the world's more complex. And when we deploy to those complex, pretty violent environments like Afghanistan, overall there's, largely majority Canadian support for that. It waxes and wanes over the course of deployment. So I think those narratives about who we are internationally have shifted over time.
Timothy Sale, what say you?
I agree generally that Canadians don't know too much about this military history after the Second World War. I think people have a sense, maybe depending on their generation, of a few key peacekeeping moments. But there's not a lot of awareness of what the Canadian military was doing for these decades and decades after the Second World War. And I think that's a shame because even when those forces were not deployed as part of peacekeeping operations or other military operations, they were still serving a purpose and they were still shaping the world they live in. And so Canadian military operations after the Second World War, I think, have shaped our world more than Canadians realize.
This collision between tech and geopolitics. We've heard some examples from George. You want to, anything else on your list you think we ought to know about that we need to add to it?
I definitely add chips, semiconductors. This is really where I think things really hit home. We talked a little bit about supply chains and you heard that. And this really started when, frankly, COVID hit and we started to become really aware of the word supply chains. It became common dinner conversation, frankly. And it really raised awareness on the vulnerability of what we used to think was just-in-time delivery, really this idea that globalization, being unfettered, worked for us. And then all of a sudden, not only are we scrambling for masks, which we did, we're scrambling certainly for, all things PPE, and not to forget the fact that chips were a big component of that and that they were really just not available. And we have a system today where a lot of our consumer products are smart. I mean, once you say smart, it's, the Internet of Things, they're connected online, they need chips. And so washing machines have chips now in it. So it's become ubiquitous in all of our consumer goods. And so what COVID did was really opened our eyes to this vulnerability and this nationalism of making sure that our supply chains are secure and safe, and just-in-time delivery no longer sufficed, not for the average person and certainly not for policymakers, and it became suddenly a national security interest. And so geopolitics and national security really came to light, I think, because of COVID. Not to say that it hadn't preceded that with Trump's trade wars, which he started with China initially back in 2018, but it just hit home. And lastly, I'm going to put in there is populism. Let's not forget, because at the end of the day, this idea of relying on external sources, this idea of relying on unfettered globalization, just no longer was something that I think the average public was going to put up with.
What do you think of when you think of Ontario?
So I think in many ways, Ontario is emblematic of Canada in that, it's difficult to define what it is to be a Canadian, and I think in so many ways it's difficult to define what it is to be an Ontarian, but that's also its source of strength. It's a place where you can come, be yourself, plant your feet and discover what it is to you. And so I think that is actually one of the distinctive strengths of Ontario.
All right, Amanda, you come at it with a distinct and unique approach in terms of Ontario. When you think of Ontario, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different for me because I'm a Francophone, so Franco-Ontarian, but I do identify with Ontario, although more as a Canadian, but I do think as an Ontarian, the more I travel, the more I realize how being Ontarian is really being flexible and fluid and learning about and knowing about so many different cultures and being adaptable. And I found that as I travel the country and internationally, being Ontarian is what gave me those opportunities to be so comfortable in any setting. And I think it's because even within our own province, we have Northern Ontario, we have the National Capital area, we have the rural areas, we have the GTA in Toronto. So we're already able to understand different communities, and so that really, to me, it's being flexible and fluid and very adaptable.
And that is the agenda for Friday, November 15th, 2024. Monday on the program, we look at concerns over Canada's food system being undermined by monopoly. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you again back here on Monday.